So welcome to the latest EUPJ webinar. We're just going to wait a second or two before starting because people are just hooking up, and then we'll be off to the races. Okay. Nope. Okay. Welcome. Welcome to the latest EUPJ webinar. I'm Bill Etchickson. I'm the director of the Brussels office of the EUPJ. Today's subject is really fascinating. It's about Jewish languages. And here in Europe, I think it's particularly pertinent since many of the languages come from Europe. But over the last 2 centuries, there's been a lot of growth in these languages, and we've transformed traditional languages throughout the world. But after the Holocaust and the changes more recently, and the emigration to Israel and the predominance of Hebrew and English, many of these languages, Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, Jewish Neo-Aramaic, which was in Iran and Iraq, and Judeo-Malaysian, I mean, they feel a bit endangered. So we have 3 of the world's greatest specialists in Jewish languages to talk to us today. First, we have Sarah Bunim-Benor, who's a professor of contemporary Jewish studies and linguistics at the Hebrew Union College and USC. And she's speaking, thank her for waking up very early. She's speaking to us from Los Angeles. She'll start off with a presentation that will be a global presentation of the present day struggle to maintain Jewish languages. Then we have Ora Schwartzwald from Israel. Thank you for joining us, Ora. She's president of the Israeli National Academy of Ladino and a professor emeritus at the Bar Ilan University. She's a linguist, and her talk will be especially focused on Ladino, the language of the Jewish Spanish emigration, or after the Spanish Inquisition. And finally, we're here in Brussels. We're delighted to have a member of our local community, IJC, Harry Swaloff, who is a remarkable, I know him personally, a remarkable linguist. He was a European Commission translator, and he's a Yiddish specialist. And he'll, I think, chime in about what he hears and give a particular emphasis on the fate and the future of Yiddish. So let's get started. Sarah, you're up. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here today, and it's just so great that we can have conversations across oceans. So I'm going to start with the ancient land of Israel, that purple dot in the middle of the screen. And as you can see, in antiquity and subsequently, Jews have spread all around the Middle East, North Africa, parts of Asia, and a lot of Europe, and subsequently even further. And wherever Jews have lived, they have usually picked up a version of the local language and Judaified it. So they have spoken Judeo-Arabic and Judeo-Portuguese, Judeo-Italian, Judeo-Persian, etc. And Malayalam is a language in southern India. And the 2 most famous Jewish languages, Yiddish and Ladino, are actually exceptions to this history because they were maintained for centuries away from their lands of origin. When Jews moved from Germanic to Slavic lands, they maintained their Germanic language. They were expelled from Spain in 1492 and ended up in the Ottoman Empire and North Africa. They maintained their Judeo-Spanish language, which is known by many today as Ladino. Now, there were some historical developments that led to changes in these languages. And one of those was in the 18th to 20th centuries when Jews were emancipated, and also modernization more broadly and urbanization in these countries led to Jews picking up different languages or diminishing the distinctive features in their own Jewish language varieties. And in the 20th century, the Holocaust and Stalinism led to the deaths of a lot of speakers of these languages and also diminished their use in that way. And in the 19th to 21st centuries, migrations out of these areas to the Americas, to Israel, and to Western Europe also led to the decline of these languages. So based on all this, all of these migrations and other factors, what we see is the creation of new Jewish language varieties. So Jewish versions of English, Latin American Spanish, Portuguese in South America, and Swedish and French and German, Russian, and Hungarian in Europe. And these new Jewish languages are thriving and developing. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the long-standing Jewish language varieties like Yiddish, Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, etc. And the question is, how are they doing today? Now, to answer that question, we need to turn to, first I just want to point out that Yiddish is actually doing very well. You might think of Yiddish as an endangered language, but it's really not. Why? Because Hasidic communities use this language intergenerationally. It's a vibrant language because children are learning it. And outside of Hasidic communities in the New York area and Antwerp and Israel and elsewhere, Yiddish-speaking communities are diminishing. That is, that younger people are much less likely than their great-grandparents to speak Yiddish in those non-Hasidic communities. But in those communities, there is strong post-vernacular engagement. That means that people are engaging with the language even though they're not using it as a vernacular, as their primary language of communication. So it means they're celebrating the language and singing songs in the language and using words from the language within English and other languages. Now, aside from Yiddish, my main point is that almost all of these other languages are endangered. So how do we determine what is endangered? Well, there is a scale of intergenerational disruption. And here you see languages, the labels for languages that are doing very well, that are the languages of national communication and educational use. And only Yiddish fits into these categories. But here we have the less good categories, languages that are threatened, meaning they're used in face-to-face communication within all generations, but they're losing users, or they're shifting or moribund or nearly extinct and then dormant, or perhaps it is used as a symbol of heritage identity, like that post-vernacular use that I talked about. And then the final stage, which is extinct, that is no longer used and no one retains a sense of ethnic identity. So how are Yiddish languages doing on this scale? Well, according to Ethnologue, which is an authoritative scale of language vitality, we see that most of these languages are not doing so well. They're either shifting or moribund or nearly extinct. And the exceptions are Judeo-Tajik and Judeo-Tat, which are not quite as endangered, but still threatened. But this scale doesn't talk about post-vernacular activity, so I'm going to talk about that in my talk, and you'll see that for some of these Jewish languages, there is not any post-vernacular activity, but for several of them, there is. So I'm going to speak about 5 of the languages that you might not have heard much about: Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Tat, Judeo-Median, Jewish Malayalam, and Jewish Neo-Aramaic. And I'm going to, for each one, give a brief history, talk about their current status and post-vernacular activity. So let's do this. Judeo-Arabic. So where is or was Judeo-Arabic spoken? All of these yellow areas on the map, in areas mostly that are Arabic speaking. And there were some texts in ancient and medieval times, and you might have heard of some of the most famous texts in Judeo-Arabic, works by Saadia Gaon, Yehuda Halevi, and Maimonides. And there are many varieties of Judeo-Arabic in the modern period, and in countries like Libya, Morocco, Syria, etc., they are the Judeo-Arabic versions there are more similar to the non-Jewish varieties than to each other, but they also have some common traits. There have been many periodicals in Judeo-Arabic in the 19th and 20th centuries in Bombay, where there was an Iraqi Judeo-Arabic speaking community, and Oran, Algeria, and Cairo in Egypt, Tunis, Morocco, and Baghdad. And in the 1940s to 1960s, mostly after the establishment of the State of Israel, when a lot of Jews were no longer welcome in Arab lands, most of them moved to elsewhere, especially Israel, France, Canada, Mexico, and the US. There is still a sizable Jewish community in North Africa today, about 3,000 Jews in Morocco, but most of them speak French, and a small community in Tunisia, and they do tend to speak the Muslim version of Tunisian Arabic, and some of the older Jews there do still speak Judeo-Arabic. Now, the Israeli government offers financial support for cultural production in Yiddish and Ladino, but not in Judeo-Arabic and other languages. So the status of Judeo-Arabic in Israel is not as high as it should be. Even so, there is some cultural production, some films, and some music, which I'm going to show you some examples of now. And we'll see both traditional and more contemporary versions of Judeo-Arabic music in Israel.
الحباب عملوا الولاء وعرضوه على زهر الفاسية تجيه وتغنيه ونشوفوا زين على شدوي ونشوفوا زين على شدوي هو ليبيا كوانيكيا هو ليبيا كوانيكيا أنا نحلف لي إذا يشبالي أنا نحلف لي اللي يشبالي عمري ما ندوزك وقول لي
to that, but we have a lot more to cover. So there's also a more contemporary version of Judeo-Arabic music, and this is a wonderful group of Yemenite Jews in Israel called Awa. Combine traditional songs in Judeo-Arabic with more contemporary music. So Judeo-Arabic is in stage 8A, it's moribund, but there is some post-vernacular use, and it is important for group identity among some descendants of Judeo-Arabic speakers. Moving along to Judeo-Tat or Juhuri. Now this is a language spoken in this area right here, which is Kazakhstan and Dagestan in former Soviet republics. And you can see, so this is the group that is often known as Mountain Jews or Kavkazim or Caucasian, all of which are kind of misnomers, but they are, especially in cities like Derbent, Baku, and Kuba, the community has been present there since antiquity. Now, what language do they speak? Well, they speak Judeo-Tat, this language here, which is on the Persian branch of the Iranian language family, and we'll come back to this language family in a few minutes. So it is kind of similar to Persian, but it's not mutually intelligible. It's also similar to Muslim Tat, but not mutually intelligible. There are many differences between Tat and Muslim, Judeo-Tat and Muslim Tat. There are some periodicals written originally in Hebrew letters in 1915, one called Echo of the Mountains, then in Latin letters, and then in Cyrillic letters. Why the switches from alphabet to alphabet? That had to do with Soviet language policy. And in fact, in 1938, Judeo-Tat was one of the 10 official languages in the USSR Republic of Dagestan, which was one of the few times in history when a Jewish language was an official language of a country. But from the 19th century till today, Judeo-Tat has slowly been replaced by Azerbaijani, Russian, and other languages in the Caucasus region, and by Hebrew in Israel. Some older people still use it, and parents use it as a secret language when they don't want the kids to understand. And there is some post-vernacular activity, some music in this language. But it is still transmitted to children in one town in Azerbaijan. It's called Kirmizi Kasaba or Krasnaya Sloboda in the Kuba district of Azerbaijan. And here are some pictures of the town. And they have, it's a Jewish town. It's, you know, one of these few Jewish towns outside of Israel. And here's the school, the Cheder, it says there up on the top. And here's the cemetery, and you can see Hebrew and also Slavic letters on the graves there. But even in Kirmizi Kasaba, all community members also speak other languages, and educational instruction is in other languages. So there, I would say it's in stage 6B, it's threatened that the language is used for face-to-face communication within all generations, but it is losing users. Next, we turn to Judeo-Median. Now, Judeo-Median is not just one language, it is many different languages that are not mutually intelligible, and here's where it is on the Iranian language family. It's not Persian languages, but it's on the Median branch here, the northwestern branch. And so people who speak Persian do not understand these languages. And there are several varieties spoken in various cities and towns throughout Iran. And for example, Kashani, Isfahani, Hamadani, Borujerdi, Yazdi, Kermani, and Shirazi. And here you can see some examples of words in these languages, just to give you a sense of how there's some similarities, like the word for cat is similar in these four, and different but similar in these four, but you know, all the other words are slightly different in each of the languages. Now, in the mid-20th century, most Jews in those areas moved to Tehran and other major cities, and even when they stayed in the cities that they were in before, they tended to shift to modern Persian because of greater integration into society and greater education. But even when they spoke modern Persian, they still used some Hebrew words. And from 1979 to the present, most Jews from Iran have left, emigrating especially to New York, Los Angeles, and Israel. And so this group of languages is in stage 8A. It's moribund, and there is no post-vernacular engagement except for documentation by outsiders. And I've been working on this, trying to raised some money for documentation, but there's just really little interest in the community in these languages because they see Farsi, Persian, as their special language and aren't interested in these languages that were spoken by their elders. Now, moving along to another language also spoken in Iran, Jewish Neo-Aramaic. In this region here, here's another map. It's the Kurdish region that is in between Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. And this is an ancient Jewish community and also an ancient language. It's very similar to, not exactly the same, but similar to the language of the Talmud. And we can also see various dots on this map of where Jews lived in this area and spoke various Jewish versions of Aramaic. It was spoken by several thousand Jews in towns and in some towns, and then some just by a few families in small villages. Now, the Jewish dialects are more similar to each other than to the local Christian Aramaic dialects. And here are some examples of that, just some words that you can see are kind of similar in the Jewish varieties, but different in the Christian ones, but also not exactly the same in the Jewish varieties. Now, Jews in this region also spoke other local languages like Kurdish, Turkish, Farsi, Arabic, and Russian, and it was pretty common for people to be multilingual. Most speakers of Jewish Neo-Aramaic moved to Israel, some to the US and some to Europe. And in Israel today, it is still spoken by elderly Jews from two different areas, from Kurdistani regions and also one called Nash Didan, our people, from Iranian Azerbaijan, northwest Iran. And in Jerusalem, there is some post-vernacular activity, monthly cultural gatherings, poetry readings, stand-up comedy, and call-in radio shows. But the participation in these kind of vernacular and kind of post-vernacular activities is dwindling as the competent speakers are getting older. There is a great book about this language, and I highly recommend it, by Ariel Sabar, called My Father's Paradise, where Ariel Sabar wrote about his father, Yonah Sabar, who's a scholar of Jewish Neo-Aramaic, and it's one of the few books that is about scholarship. And I just used it, a chapter in my class on contemporary Jewish languages, and the students loved it. They felt like they were reading a novel. So this language is in stage 8A. It is moribund, but there is some post-vernacular use. And the final language I'm going to talk about today is Jewish Malayalam. Malayalam is spoken in southern India, and it is this is a Jewish version in the long-standing Jewish community in Kerala, India, that region in southern India, in towns and cities like Cochin, Ernakulam, Parur, Chenamangalam, and Mala. Now, the first evidence of Jews in this region is from the 9th century, traders that arrived in that region via the Indian Ocean. And we do have some texts in this language, but they're mostly written in Malayalam script, not in Hebrew letters, like other Jewish languages throughout history. And some of these texts are Bible stories and prayers translated into Jewish Malayalam. And there are also some songs, especially Jewish women's wedding songs from the 18th century on. Now, this language variety is mostly intelligible to Hindu, Christian, and Muslim speakers of Malayalam, but it's most similar to the Muslim variety, interestingly. So here are some little examples of that. So for example, you can see that Jews and Muslims both say Ummah for mother, compared to Amma among Christians and Hindus. And you can just take a look at these other words here. Now, the community members who spoke Jewish Malayalam moved to Israel in two ways, in the 1950s and the 1970s, and now there are only a few dozen Jews that remain in the region, and most have shifted to the local language variety and don't maintain those distinctive Jewish features in their language. However, there is still a pretty good deal of post-vernacular activity. In Jerusalem, a group of women meet regularly to speak in Malayalam and study the script. These are descendants of the immigrants. And there are sing-alongs and singing troupes that perform these wedding songs. And I'll give you just a few little examples of that. This singing troupe here performing wedding songs in a more performance-oriented setting. Okay, so we see this language is in stage 8A as well, moribund, but there is some post-vernacular use, and among Indian Jews in Israel, it's important for their group identity. So in conclusion, we see that most long-standing Jewish language varieties are moribund, and sadly, in the next 20 to 30 years, the last speakers of many of these languages will likely die. So now is the time to document these language varieties and their associated cultures and histories. And also now is the time to share the knowledge, now when some speakers are still alive and able to share their wisdom. Why should we document these languages? Well, for the speakers themselves, like Simon Mardechayev in New York, who's originally from Azerbaijan and a speaker of Judeo-Tat. Or for Sarah Cohen, who recently passed away in India and was one of the last speakers of this language. It's also important for scholarship, for people doing research on language, and for students who might someday want to learn these languages. And it's important for Jews around the world who don't necessarily know about all of these diverse communities throughout history, and it would be really helpful for young Jews to learn about the diversity of the diaspora, especially through language. And it's not just important for Jews, it's also important for other indigenous, immigrant, and religious groups to learn about the diversity of the Jewish world and to perhaps learn some concepts that can be useful for analyzing and for revitalizing their own languages. Now, how can we document and educate about these languages? Well, there are a number of edited volumes about Jewish languages, including one that I edited with my colleague Benjamin Hari that has articles about long-standing Jewish languages, including one by our esteemed colleague Ora Schwarzwald, who will be speaking in a few minutes, and some on new Jewish language varieties, like on Jewish Swedish and Latin American Spanish. In addition to scholarship, there are also documentation projects. That is, projects like Mother Tongue, the project in Israel, and Endangered Language Alliance, Living Tongues Institute, and Wikitongues in the United States that are trying to document these endangered Jewish languages and create dictionaries and online resources so that people will eventually be able to learn these languages. And my own initiative called the Jewish Language Project at Hebrew Union College Our mission is to promote research on, awareness about, and engagement surrounding the many languages spoken and written by Jews throughout history and around the world. My vision is that every known Jewish language variety will be well documented. Comparative research on the different ways of speaking in different Jewish communities will flower. Post-vernacular activities will increase, and many Jewish children and adults will learn about Jewish language varieties. So we have a few current projects. One is documenting endangered Iranian Jewish languages. Another is a research consortium for scholars who are documenting endangered Jewish languages. We're just starting that project now. And I'm hoping to do a project, I've applied for funding, a curriculum for Jewish schools and camps on Jewish linguistic diversity. And this is in addition to some other projects on Jewish English that I'm working on right now, like recording entries in the Jewish English lexicon. And here is the website that I maintain, and you can see videos and text and sound samples and find a list of researchers and translators. There's also a whole exhibit on Passover where you can hear Chad Gadya and Who Knows One in multiple Jewish languages. Thank you very much for your interest in Jewish language varieties. And now I'm really looking forward to hearing the responses by my colleagues.
Sarah, that's really interesting. I just wanted to encourage the audience. They can post questions, raise their hand, put them in the chat. Harry, please pick up some ideas. But Sarah, I did have a question just to launch the debate, which was,
Sure.
Do most Jewish communities want to preserve these languages, or are they seen as sort of symbols of a troubled past and that they should be discarded? Is there debate over whether what you're doing is really not just useful but important for Jewish identity?
Yeah, great question. It's different in different communities. And that's where the post-vernacular activity comes in. And so we really see that in the case of Yiddish, and we'll see from Professor Schwarzwald in a minute about Judeo-Spanish, that it's so, there is so much interest in those communities, in those languages, less in others. You know, it's a continuum. And I would say there's the least interest in the Iranian languages. I just haven't, I've tried to connect with community members in Los Angeles, Iranian Jews, and there's a little interest. Some have come forward to record, and we have a number of recordings in this project, but most are just not interested, and they think of these languages as not real languages. They're dialects, you know, and they're not. There's just very little interest, and I'm hoping to raise awareness so that people will be interested in their community's past, even if it's seen as something not so pleasant in their history because they weren't, you know, standard languages.
And what is the attitude of the Israeli government? Do they support this, or do they want to see them disappear, these languages?
There is definitely support there, and I mentioned that there is, well, I'm sure Professor Schwarzwald can talk about this more, but there's some funding available, especially for Yiddish and Ladino, but there is also increasing interest in these other languages, and the project like Mother Tongue is, you know, really raising awareness. Yehudit Henschke has been writing about this and interviewing about this, and I think there is increasing awareness and interest in Israeli society.
Okay, over to you, Harry.
If I may.
Comments? Yeah, and Ora, please go jump in.
Yeah, there is a great interest in Israel. There is once in 2 years there is a conference on Jewish languages, and we hear about these some of these languages. I wouldn't say all of them. I think there is one researcher of Malayalam, and but Judeo-Arabic is gaining a lot of research, all kinds. I mean, from Iraq, from Yemen, from Morocco, and from other communities. Yeah. Okay.
Sarah, perhaps I can ask a few questions and make a
Sure.
few minor comments. First of all, my own field for which I was announced, Yiddish. As far as I can see, there are three categories of Yiddish speakers at the moment. One, fast dwindling, the survivors of the pre-war generations who were brought up in Yiddish. Unfortunately, that's a disappearing group. The second, of course, is the Haredim and the Hasidim, who speak it amongst themselves, but who are not truly integrated in society as large, certainly not in New York and Antwerp, and I believe not in Israel either. So the last category, to which I suppose people born after the Second World War belong, myself included, people who've studied Yiddish as an academic subject and have practiced it. Now, these are three groups that have a lot in common because they use Yiddish, but it's quite different compared to other living languages, because neither group, none of these three groups speak and use a productive Yiddish, by which I mean Hasidim and closed communities like that are unlikely to produce new vocabulary, new forms of grammar, and as a normal language does with living within a community. And the same applies to, in a different way, to academic speakers of Yiddish. First of all, everyone who learns Yiddish at university or the course learns what is now called the standard language, basically Litvak, Lithuanian Yiddish, developed and strengthened by the YIVO, the Yiddish Institute. Now, my question to you is, Yiddish is alive. I don't think it's well, but it's alive. It has been said that it is a dying language, but just add a little anecdote with which you're probably familiar. About 110, 120 years ago in Chernovich, there was a major Yiddish conference, the most important one, and perhaps the only one, bringing together Yiddish linguists and writers on the subject of Yiddish, the future. And the reason was that there was a lot of pressure from Zionists to switch to Hebrew, and a lot of pressure from modern Jews to switch to German. And now the question was, do we maintain Yiddish? And several people commented, Yiddish is dead, Yiddish is a dying language, it will disappear, until one speaker got up and said, listen, for the last 3 years, we've been talking about Yiddish being a dead language. And what language did we use? Yiddish. So it doesn't make sense. But basically my question is, and it may apply to other Jewish languages, how productive is the Yiddish spoken today?
Yeah, great question. It's very productive in the Hasidic community. There is some new research coming out that indicates that it is changing grammatically and developing in really interesting ways, not just based on influences from English and modern Hebrew in the places where it's most spoken, but independent developments that indicate that it is a really vibrant language. As you said, language is a sign of vitality, is that they're changing, and they are. And so yeah, stay tuned for some more research on that, but there is already some research in the journal that I edit, the Journal of Jewish Languages, special issue on Hasidic Yiddish a year or two ago. So yeah, I'd say that it's absolutely true that outside of the Hasidic world, it's not spoken in as productive ways. I mean, it is spoken in vernacular ways. People use it for everyday communication. But you're right that when they speak it there, they are not interested in the contemporary influences from other languages. They want to make up their own new words. Anyway, we better leave time for Ora Schwarzwald's talk. So we could go on about Yiddish for the
I
rest of
want,
the hour, but yeah.
I
Well, if-
want to comment on that.
Bill, can I ask one more question?
Yes, please do. We can run a little over.
Okay, great.
For once, it's not about Yiddish, it's about Judeo-Arabic. I'm also interested in that, not only because I'm a linguist, but my surname actually comes from Moroccan, Jewish Moroccan, from the language of Maimonides. You mentioned very briefly, but it fascinates me, what are the common traits of the various Judeo-Arabic languages? Is it the Hebrew-Aramaic element? Is it the fact that they have a similar intonation? What is it? Because I know that Arabic from Morocco and Arabic, say, from Egypt, are mutually not necessarily intelligible unless they speak something higher like classical Arabic. So I wonder how it works between Jews speaking Judeo-Arabic.
Yeah, you're right. They do speak in the grammatical system and pronunciation more similar to their non-Jewish neighbors than to each other. But you're right that it's the Hebrew and Aramaic elements that bring them together. And there are a lot of shared words because of that, and integrated into the local languages in similar ways. And also there is some interesting similarities. So apparently in Egypt, there are some features from Moroccan, Judeo-Arabic, and this is the case in some Jewish communities around the world, what's called migrated dialectalism or regionalisms, where there might be Jewish communities in multiple places that speak that language, and they have some interaction with each other, some migration. And so you see that in Italy, where forms from Southern Judeo-Italian end up in Northern Judeo-Italian, and you see that in the examples I gave from Jewish Neo-Aramaic, where the local dialects are more similar to each other than to their non-Jewish neighbors. So, yes. And you even see this in Jewish English today, where Jews in America have some influences from New York regional speech when they don't live in New York. Like, I did not grow up in New York, but I say horrible in Florida instead of horrible in Florida, because that is a common thing for some Jews around the United States. So another example of migrated dialectalism.
Thank you,
Sarah. That's really interesting. We have one question before we get to Ora, which is about, you concentrated a lot, it's from, I think, Luxembourg, and we concentrated a lot on Middle East and Far East, but what about in Europe? What's happening with the other sort of languages, like the one that is mentioned here is Judeo-Alsatian or Western Yiddish, which I don't know what it is, but maybe you could just quickly tell us a little bit about the fate of these European languages.
Yeah. So as far as I know, there are no speakers left of Alsatian or Western Yiddish, but I could be wrong about that. And actually, the project Wikitongues is looking to record speakers of these languages. So if you know anyone who speaks these languages, please connect them to me, or just have them look up Wikitongues and get in touch. They're looking to record every language in the world. That's their project, and also to educate about it and preserve, document it, right? But yeah, so the situation with Western Yiddish and Alsatian, it's not so good. It's much more dire than Eastern Yiddish. But one interesting thing is there is a community in Switzerland and elsewhere in Western Europe, where Central and Western, of cattle traders who maintain some elements of Western Yiddish, especially Hebrew influences, because they were part of the cattle trading jargon. And these are, before the Holocaust, Jews were really involved in this industry. Now, not after that, but unfortunately, but the non-Jews who still live there still maintain some of these words. And so there has been some recent research on that, and that's another interesting vestige of Western Yiddish, an endangered Jewish language.
Interesting.
Right.
So, all of
And
you
there
out
was,
there, if you know any speakers of Judeo-Alsatian or Western Yiddish, please do contact us, because we can send them to Sarah, and hopefully this will assist your research, this project.
Yeah, and then also to answer your question further, there is some funding available in two European countries, in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Sweden, based on the charter of and in Sweden there's funding available for Yiddish, and in Bosnia-Herzegovina for Ladino. And in these Judeo-Spanish, it's used by, it goes by both names. And there's a really interesting article about the latter situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the Journal of Jewish Languages by Gabi Abramatz. And there's a lot of interesting activity. I mean, now especially in Spain regarding, and Portugal regarding, descendants of people who were expelled from Spain and Portugal and are now allowed to apply for citizenship, and language plays a big role in that process.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a perfect introduction to Professor Schwarzwald's presentation on Ladino, which is one of the major Jewish European languages. So over to you, Ora, in
okay.
Jerusalem.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Sarah, for the interesting introduction. I will relate to it later, but I want to start with some general comments. And I want to put my presentation. Okay. Okay. My claim is that religiousness and close social contact are the reasons for the creation of and development of Jewish languages, and the lack of them to their deterioration of the Jewish languages. Regarding the religion, the Jewish religion entails using a lunar calendar year with fixed dates for celebration of events in the history of the Jews, Yom Kippur, Hanukkah, Purim, etc. Each of the events is accompanied with special Hebrew and a little bit of Aramaic texts, the daily Siddur and the holiday Machzor, and the other texts on each holiday. These texts were known to every Jew due to routine reading of the texts. Eating habits accompany these dates and texts. Refraining from eating on special dates like Yom Kippur. Other days of the year had some culinary habits. The Shabbat meals, Passover with no leaven products, Shavuot with dairy products, not to mention refraining from eating certain foods. And Jewish laws encourage the Jewish community to keep close to the community institution, especially the shul. And this brings me to the second element, the social contact. Close social interaction is the primary cause for the formation of any language variety. The necessity to live within walking distance to the community centers kept the Jewish communities close, the Jewish people close together even before the creation of the ghettos. Having the religious texts as primary educational resource and the constant citation of the religious texts during the Jewish year influenced the use of the language and created the special Jewish language. Weakening of these factors, the religiousness and close social contact, is the main reason for the changes in the Jewish communities. It is not surprising that only Yiddish is still a living language. It is kept only in the ultra-Orthodox communities. They use the Jewish calendar year. They adhere to tradition texts in Hebrew script. They live within walking distance from their shul. They keep constant contacts on the basis of social, business, and Torah learning. Their religiousness and close social contacts remains intact, and children acquire it as a native language. Sarah Benoit mentioned these factors for the deterioration of Jewish languages: emancipation, modernization, urbanization, migration to Western Europe, Israel, and the Americas, and in the 20th century, the Holocaust and Stalinism. To these, I would like to add nationalism, secularization, and the Enlightenment movement. The Enlightenment movement and the creation of new nations in Europe had a very important impact on the weakening of the Jewish languages in general and on Judeo-Spanish in particular. Jews immigrated to other countries in order to acquire general education or to improve their economic situation. Being away from their home country loosened the religious social pressure, leading to the abandonment of the religious customs. They adjusted to the new social environment in overt behaviors, in dress codes, and in the languages they used. As Sarah, she wanted to show, but she didn't, Ladino speakers moved to Western Europe, to the Americas, and also to Africa, to Rhodesia. The Zionist movement encouraged Jews to immigrate to Palestine. Social pressure of the new environments to adopt the local and national languages made them abandon the Jewish languages, feeling that it is unsuitable for modern life. The dispersion of the people in the new locations didn't enable them to use Ladino as before. Even when groups of Ladino speakers settled together in new locations, such as Seattle in the United States, Tzur Moshe, Yehud, and Jaffa in Israel, they would speak Ladino among themselves, but they would speak the national language in other circumstances. In order to socialize in the new country, they did not inherit the language to their children. In cases of marriage with members of non-speaking Ladino, the only possible communicating language was the language of the country. Gradually, the use of Ladino decreased, so that even the traditional liturgical texts like the Ladino Passover Haggadah were translated or transcribed in the letters of the country. Thus we have, for instance, a Haggadah, a Greek Haggadah with Greek translation and Ladino in Roman letters. They also copied an old Haggadah. A Bulgarian Haggadah, which is totally in Cyrillic letters. It's with no translation written in Ladino, but it's entirely in Cyrillic letters. And an English Haggadah from Seattle with a transcription of Ladino into Latin letters with an English translation. Ladino today is spoken as a native language by people over 60 years old, maybe more. When they die, there will be no native speakers. However, there is a lot of activities for its preservation. First of all, many institutions are involved in systematic instruction of the language at the Salti Center at Bar-Ilan University, at Ben-Gurion University, at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Courses are also taught in Madrid, in France, and Hamburg, and in the United States, depending on the availability of the teachers. There are also informal courses in various locations. Textbooks for teaching the language are written in Israel and abroad. Several dictionaries are published in Roman script. So far, only one online with Hebrew translation. Documentation started towards the end of the 19th century and continues extensively today. Regarding publications, many texts are published in Ladino today. Some of them are Latin transcriptions of old texts which were written in Hebrew script. Some texts transcribe recordings of native speakers. A few poets write poems in Ladino, mostly published in bilingual editions, and some individuals sometimes publish books in Judeo-Spanish written in Roman letters. Another trend in recent years is to publish new translations to the traditional Ladino texts. Two children books and CD records include translated Hebrew children's songs into Ladino. It's called Ye Ladino. You see, this is the cover of these two books. It comes with a CD. I'm sorry, I don't have the recording here. But this is done. It's actively done. Much research is done around the world on oral and written materials, and many people are involved in the research. It's they study written and oral materials and from different aspects: linguistics, literature, music, folklore, history, social aspects, mostly in Israel and Spain, but not only there. The theoretical issues are listed here. I want just to mention the eighth one. There is a variety of literature, written texts. There are liturgical translations, halachic translations, rabbinic writings, Jewish novels, translated novels, periodicals, romances, coplas, songs, riddles, folk stories, cookbooks, proverbs, and so on. There is a lot to do research on. There are academic publications. Several journals are devoted only to Judeo-Spanish. Ladinar at Bar Ilan, right now I'm the editor. El Presente at Ben Gurion University. We have these two in Germany, but they don't appear regularly lately. Cadernos de Estudos Sefarditas in Portugal, and Meldar, a new one in Spain, dealing only with Judeo-Spanish things. Other journals also focus on Hispanic and Sephardic matters in general. The main publishers are Terocinio in Barcelona, Ben Tzvi Institute in Jerusalem, and the Center for Sciences in Madrid. But there are many other academic activities, and I mentioned the conference from 1979, a biannual conference on Judeo-Spanish exists. At first, it was only in England. Now it's in, well, we can see it perhaps. Now it's it in turns in Spain, in Israel, in Portugal, every 2 years. There is the UC Ladino Club. They have some lectures. In special sections in the Conference on Jewish Languages, in the Congress of World Congress of Jewish Studies. They had the last Congress had 3 days devoted to Judeo-Spanish. A special section at the AJS, and the European Congress on Jewish Studies. And around 1992, there were a lot of conferences around the world, because it was the 5 years since the expulsion from Spain. Special institutions deal with Judeo-Spanish, the national authority of Ladino and its culture. Its government, it is financed by the government. Instituto de Estudios Sefardíes in, I skipped, in Madrid, the Salti Institute for the study of Ladino Sefarad deals with history and culture, not necessarily the language, and the National Ladino Academy established only in 2020, and we couldn't do much because of the corona. There are many non-academic publications. Aki Yerushalayim is a periodical. There were 100 issues written, and now it's online in Israel. Shalom in Turkey, in Istanbul, has one page. It's a weekly journal. One page is in Judeo-Spanish. El Amanecer is monthly, and it's in Judeo-Spanish. La Letra Sefarad, Los Muestros in Brussels, and La Letra Sefarad, it's published in English and in French. And the Ladino Comunità is the most popular online discussion group in which Judeo-Spanish is used actively. I mean, people write and communicate only in Judeo-Spanish in this group, and it's very rich. I mean, if you're connected to this group, you get a few messages every day. Other groups or the internet are either societies or organizations that relate to non-Ashkenazi world. And this is, some people include in Sephardic also those that are not Ashkenazi, namely those that speak Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Aramaic, or any other language which is not Yiddish. And in the Jewish languages site, there is some information about Judeo-Spanish, and eSefarad is the most active information published weekly, and actually it's about almost a year that every Sunday afternoon, it's at around 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, there is a discussion in Ladino, only in Ladino, on various subjects. Now, Sarah mentioned performances. Bustan Sfaradi, Sephardic Orchard, was written by Yitzhak Navon, the 5th president of Israel. It's played over and over in Israel. It brings Sephardic life in Jerusalem at the beginning of the 20th century. The songs, proverbs, and translated idioms in the play carry Judeo-Spanish flavor. It's currently performed again. Other original plays are performed in Israel and in Turkey, and they're mostly done by amateurs, not professional actors. And there was a Festi Ladino, which was a Judeo-Spanish contest song, and it attracted many people. And Judeo-Spanish songs, romances, are performed over and over by various groups in Israel and abroad, and they attract very many people. Now, there among the non-academic activities, I must mention Matilda Cohen-Serrano. It's a one-woman enterprise. She published books of stories that she collected, songs, cookbook, dictionary, and lately a conversation book. You see, it's made for Israelis, but it can be done for English speakers as well. You can have the conversation. Here is and visita a visit. Oh, qué hermosa sorpresa! You see, for the Hebrew speakers, it teaches them how to speak. Since 1913, there is a Ladino International Day where it's celebrated all around the world. The National Authority for Ladino and its culture organizes various activities every month involving musical, culinary, and other folkloristic events, but most of the talks are in Hebrew. And the Salty Center for the study of Ladino at Bar-Ilan University organizes Marathon Ladino, a Ladino marathon twice a year with discussions, and it's half academic because it includes music, but it also brings the lectures about areas that are studied. And there are informal meetings. I participated in a group. It stopped because of the corona, but every first Monday of the month, there was a meeting of people interested in the language that spoke the language, and one of them gave a lecture. A look to the future. The most important thing is to document the written and oral tradition. It is necessary for the future study of Judeo-Spanish treasures, and teaching the language and its treasures is also very, very important. Well, this is my conclusion. I'll move it a little bit so that you can see it all. It is too late to revive the language in a natural way. Ladino speakers will not turn religiously orthodox these days. It does not fit their lifestyle. They keep some of the religious customs and traditions, but not all. Moreover, they live among various societies in Israel and in other countries. They cannot have partners only from the Judeo-Spanish speaking community in order to speak the language and raise their children in this language. This is why, in spite of all the activities, Judeo-Spanish cannot survive as a language, as a native language, but as an important language of study. As things stand now, it seems that only academic research will survive actively long after the last native Judeo-Spanish speakers passes away. Okay, and thank you.
Before we leave and end, Harry, would you have some comments? And Sarah too. I'd be interested in.
I wanted to. I'm stopping the.
Because I saw muchos gracias, so that's why I jumped in. So I thought we had some time.
I wanted to comment about the Yiddish before that.
Sure.
It's a native language in the religious, in the Orthodox communities. You call them Hasidic, you call them Haredim, it doesn't matter. They're there. It's interesting that there are sermons in shul. The rabbis give sermons in shul. The sermons are mixed, Yiddish and Hebrew, because they have many citations in Hebrew. But it's interesting that when they want to publish it, they publish it in Hebrew, the same sermons. Why? Because they'll have a bigger audience. Okay, just a comment about Yiddish.
No, that's interesting, and it gets to the heart of the comparison between Yiddish and Ladino. I guess the two
Right.
biggest
That's interesting.
Jewish languages.
Sorry.
But to the future, Harry and Sarah, and your comparison with Yiddish and Ladino would be interesting. And what would you see as a success story 20, 30 years down the line to conclude?
Well, I think that perhaps if Sarah allows me to speak first, the last is interesting about the sermons in Shul, because exactly what killed off Western Yiddish in the Netherlands and in West Germany, because when Napoleon was in charge, and as everyone knows, he did a lot of good things for the Jews, but for various reasons, he recommended or advised and then ordered the end of Yiddish as a language in the shul and in schools. He forced Jewish schools in the Netherlands and in Westphalia to use only German, or Dutch and German respectively. And since the Christian authorities were suspicious of what was said in the synagogue that they couldn't understand, sermons had to be held in the vernacular, in other words, in Dutch or in High German. Now, coming back to what you said in your very interesting presentation about Ladino, you started with a remark about the importance of the moon in Jewish prayer and Jewish tradition. Of course, the sun was worshipped by people before the Canaanites and during the Canaanite society. So the sun, Shemesh, is not part of the Yiddish language. But the interesting thing, and for the very reason that you mentioned, the importance of the moon and the lunar calendar, the Yiddish word for the moon is Hebrew, is Levona. The word for sun is Zun, which is pure German. And the word for stars is Stern, which is also pure German. So the one exception is Levona. And the reason is because
it is important.
Very important. Now, another one remark and then one question, and then I'll shut up.
If I may comment.
Yes.
I stressed nationalism. Nationalism is one of the reasons. As long as the nation impose the language on the citizens, that's what happens.
Yes.
You have to use. That's why I added to your comments.
Yes.
Right.
No, that's true. It's imposed from above. And back to something that Sarah said. The distinction between Eastern Yiddish, which is very much alive, and Western Yiddish, which is definitely dead. But I was brought up in an environment, not Orthodox, but very Jewish, where there were lots and lots of Western Yiddish expressions, which were completely different from what I learned later as standard Eastern Yiddish. And if any of the listeners at this webinar are interested, I can give a few words with explanations that are Western Yiddish, some very funny actually, and that do not exist in Eastern Yiddish. But my question to you, Ora, about your talk concerns my own hometown, Amsterdam. After 1492, many Spanish and Portuguese Jews escaped to Amsterdam because it was, and still is, a very tolerant city. And the language they used, I mean, they switched to Dutch quite quickly. The language they used in their correspondence and amongst themselves was Portuguese.
Right.
And the language they used in announcements in shul, which they did not call shul, but esnoga, was Spanish.
Right.
And you were called up not as Chaim ben Yaakov, but as Chaim hijo de Yaakov.
Right.
So Spanish survived. My question to you, Ora, is why did the Sephardim who escaped to Amsterdam never use Ladino?
Good, very good question. I just want to comment. I forgot to mention that there is an Israeli program in Ladino every Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock Israeli time. You can hear how of speaking with music. Okay, to your question, why? In fact, Ladino translations do existed in the ex-converso communities. Ex-converso communities, these are the communities that left Spain and Portugal after the Jews were expelled. They slowly went to Amsterdam, to Hamburg, and to other cities, in Bayonne and Bordeaux in France. They settled there, and they kept their Portuguese, but they used Spanish in their translations. The first Ladino translations of the Bible were published in 1547 in Hebrew script in Kushta, Istanbul, okay, Kushta, Constantinople, in 1547, and in 1553, just 6 years apart, there was a Ladino translation to the whole Bible was published in Ferrara. It was published in Latin script, not in Hebrew script. Already at that time, they used Ladino translation in Roman script. And their translation is much similar. The forms in the translations are much more similar to Spanish than to Judeo-Spanish. They used Hebrew words that could not be replaced, like Omer, or place names. They copied them as they are. They didn't transfer them to the Spanish standard. But in general, the forms were much more Hispanicized, if we can say that, than the Eastern ones, those published in Istanbul at the same time. It's almost at the same time. So there are differences. And they continued using Latin because that's how they grew up. Because in order to cancel, not to cancel, to hide, in order to hide their Jewish identity, they had to conform to the Spanish and Portuguese standards. So they continued using it. So the population that came to Amsterdam were ex-conversos, the anusim, those that did not that used Christianity as an overt religion, but in fact tried to keep as much of their religion in hiding.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Sarah, maybe I'll leave you for the last word to conclude a comparison between Ladino or the futures of Ladino and Yiddish, but also an idea of where, in 40 years you would see Jewish languages. Will we only be speaking English and Hebrew basically, or will this variety sort of persist?
Mm. Well, I've been advised never to make predictions, but I guess I'll say, well, first of all, I just loved Aura's talk. It was so accurate and smart, and also dovetailed so nicely with what I was saying. And Harry, it's been great to hear your thoughts and contributions as well. And I just really appreciate that we all got to have this conversation. And I hope the people listening whose faces we can't see are also getting as much out of it as I am. So, and in the future, I do think Hebrew, modern Hebrew, and then English in America are the most central Jewish languages today, and will continue to be in the future. But there are still Jewish communities in other parts of the world, and they shouldn't be discounted. And my sense is that wherever Jews live, they speak a Jewish version of the local language. And so there has been, as I said, some research on Jewish Swedish, Jewish Russian, Jewish Latin American Spanish, but we need more. We need more research on how Jews today speak Hungarian. And actually, I'm advising a PhD student who's working on Jewish German, how Jews in Germany speak German today, with influences from Yiddish and Hebrew and other language, and Russian and other languages. And also the endangered Jewish languages that I spoke about are going to continue to have resonance for these Jewish communities all around the world. And if I have any say about it, they'll have even more resonance than they currently do, because I think there's so much potential there for post-vernacular engagement with these languages, and especially using words, for infusing words from these languages into our English and our modern Hebrew and our Hungarian, and right, and so I really do hope that I will be able to have an impact, and the other scholars and activists working in this field will be able to have an impact on the Jewish world, such that more people will be aware of these languages and study them and see them as part of the treasure trove from which they can draw as they construct their contemporary Jewish identities.
Very nice, if I
Yep.
may.
Sure, Aura, please. And how,
Pardon? Yeah.
please, Aura.
I wanted to say that following Sarah's words, they leave traces, as you said, they leave traces. I remember that I didn't mention the branch of the Judeo-Spanish, which is spoken in Morocco, in Tetuan and Tangier. It is Hakitia. It's called Hakitia. And this Hakitia, during the 20th century, it turned into Spanish, because they brought Spanish teachers from Iberian Peninsula. They taught them Spanish. They thought their language is just a corrupted, a kind of corrupt language, not a good one. But nicknames, blessings, like regular blessings, whatever you say when you finish something, you want to greet someone, that remains in the Hakitia form. So although they write Spanish, they speak almost entirely Spanish, still there are traces of their Judeo-Spanish that existed years ago. after the
And
expulsion.
you see that in the North African diaspora as well. In the community in Venezuela, there are Hakitiya words that are used not only by descendants of Moroccan immigrants, but also by other Jews there. They've become part of Jewish Venezuelan Spanish.
Right.
Perhaps I can add something. It's interesting you mentioned traces, because I've discovered that as a linguist, I am very aware that what changes first are sounds, and then words. And grammar changes very slowly over the years because it's invisible, it's unconscious. What is left, and I see it whenever I speak to my Jewish friends in Holland or in Belgium or in England, the one thing that survives the longest is intonation. And imagine you meet a Jewish friend who doesn't know a word of Yiddish. If there are no Jews, if there's only you and him or her, your intonation will be different. You'll use occasionally a Yiddish word or a Ladino word that you remember, but it's distant. If somebody announces that so-and-so speaks 20 languages fluently, an Englishman would say, oh, if he is Jewish, he would say, really? It is because the Yiddish intonation is unique. Sorry to limit this to Yiddish, but Yiddish intonation is unique in that it is the only Germanic language with Mediterranean intonation. If you were to listen to a Yiddish conversation of people who've never been further south, say, than Hungary, you will notice that their intonation is different from whatever language they speak with people around them. And that is because, to me, the intonation is very close to South Italian. It's very, very Mediterranean. And you can hear it not just in words, but mainly in sentences. When two European or American Jews meet each other and they ask each other, how are things? They don't say, how are things? How are things? You know, it's Mediterranean intonation. And that means, and people who have it are not aware of it. And I have noticed that people who have not spoken Yiddish in 3 or 4 generations still have Yiddish intonation. I noticed it at some kids when they were just talking or contradicting the teacher, which was something that happened every day. They use Yiddish intonation. Sorry, that's over to you.
I don't know if I can.
It's interesting because in Jewish languages, in many cases, old phonemes are retained as opposed to the modern ones. I know that in Judeo-Spanish. I know it occurs also in Yiddish, in Hebrew words of Yiddish, that old phonemes were retained. The greatest change is the vocabulary.
Yes, and I'm really glad you brought up intonation, Harry, because that is a hallmark as well. In addition to the archaic features that Ora just mentioned, intonation is a common distinctive feature in many Jewish languages. In fact, I just in my Jewish languages class taught an article on Judeo-Georgian, how Jews in Georgia, you know, not the one in America, but the Georgia in Central Asia, Europe, that they use a very distinctive intonation there. And it's certainly the case in America, in Jewish English. If you've heard it, you know what I'm talking about. But that's kind of extreme. But then also, if you've heard it, you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. You hear that pattern, and that is influenced by Yiddish, but also by Talmud study, because in the Talmud there isn't punctuation, and the way that you indicate the different phrases is through your intonation.
Yes, but this is the intonation used by young Jewish people who have never read the Talmud, who never went to yeshiva, never heard the word of Yiddish, but they still speak like this. They still have the Yiddish intonation. And that is the last remnant of also of Western Yiddish. By
Yeah,
the way, use the
absolutely.
word
That's right. That's
remnant.
right.
The Western Yiddish has disappeared. The language, we're not sure how it was spoken. We know how it was written. I myself have a Yiddish writer in my family tree who wrote in Western Yiddish, one of the last. But the intonation is still there. 5, 6, 7 generations. Yiddish hasn't been used in Amsterdam for so many generations, since 1830. But many of the kids that I went to school with still do like this. You know, it doesn't disappear. And I'd love to hear from Sarah or Ora why that is. How is that is not taken over from the parents because they don't speak like that. It's something almost genetic, which is a dangerous word. But as a linguist, I've always noticed, close your eyes and
You're right.
don't know the language, you recognize Jewish Yiddish intonation.
Right.
Interesting.
That's right.
Thanks, Harry, for that. And I think this could go on for a long
Nice
time.
observation.
So I hope I've begun and we've opened up and connected all three of you and to the larger EUPJ community around Europe. Thank you for taking time on a Sunday to speak to us from Israel and from the United States and from Brussels. Our next webinar will be on May 2nd. It'll be about Jewish heritage buildings and the rush to preserve them or the attempts to preserve them. So from languages to buildings, we're going to be doing a lot of culture in the next couple of weeks. Thank you again. Have a great Sunday evening and day for you, Sarah. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.